Hello, good morning. How are you all? This is 11 with Fran, and here's how it works. You settle down with a cup of tea and a piece of cake. Some of you have heard me say that many times, but it's worth repeating for the new amongst you. Also, it's terribly important. So, you settle down with a cup of tea and a piece of cake, and I read you a short story. This week, we're doing short stories all by Dorothy Whipple, and today's is called Boarding House, and it was written in about 1940, and it is very much from another time, another era, transportative, but bitingly insightful and screamingly funny in parts. So, settle in with your tea. You ready? Thank you all for joining. And here goes. Boarding House by Dorothy Whipple. It was their first season, Mrs. Pink explained to everybody. Is everything all right? She would ask anxiously, a small woman with a thin face, generally red from cooking and the excitement of running a boarding house. You see, it's our first season, she would say, with a mixture of pride and apology. She said it to all the visitors in turn. To Mr. Bagshaw, the cheerful bachelor who stipulated for a bedroom with a sea view and a table in the window of the dining room. Mr. Bagshaw liked the best for himself, but Mrs. Pink was very willing to give it to him. She said it to Mrs. Walton, who, it seemed, had travelled across England simply to sit at Mrs. Pink's front door. She was moored there, too fat to get any further. But she got the benefit of the air sitting there, she said, and she was sympathetic about its being the Pinks' first season, and often called out advice from where she sat to Mrs. Pink, scurrying about the inside of the house in the mornings when everybody was out on the beach. Mrs. Pink said the same thing to Miss Porter, who had come with her fiancé. Oh, that's all right, said Miss Porter, a smart young woman with glasses and prominent teeth. We're not hard to please, are we, Alfred? Too much in love, she said, taking Alfred's arm. We've got it badly, haven't we, Alfred? She sent an amorous look, much magnified by her glasses, at Alfred, who looked sheepish and in a moment disengaged himself. Mrs. Pink said the same thing to the Burton family, father, mother and 3 young boys, and she said it again to the 2 young girls from Nottingham, friends who worked in the same office, it appeared. 2 pretty, slender young things, so pleased with the sea. Kathleen Hill and Phoebe Wood their names were. It was a pleasure to see them about, said Mr. and Mrs. Pink to each other. Mrs. Pink having explained that it was their first season, and the visitors having suitably and reassuringly responded, the atmosphere was cleared beforehand at Rosedene, and all seemed set fair. The Pinks had gone into the boarding house business like nervous bathers entering a rough sea. They went in inch by inch, and would have turned back many a time, but Mr. Spence wouldn't let them. With loud coercive cries of encouragement, Mr. Spence drove the Pinks on. Mr. Spence was the jolly go-ahead builder from East Bay. He had developed East Bay very successfully. That is, he'd cut the fields to ribbons and run up a lot of little houses in coloured concrete, pinks, yellows, greens and blues. The Spence Park estate, in a very short time after Mr. Spence had finished it, looked camouflaged, ready for war. But that was not intentional. It was merely the blotchy action of damp on the concrete. Having developed East Bay, Mr. Spence turned his attention to West Bay. There's no accommodation for visitors here, he said to the Pinks, and lots of people want to come to a nice quiet little place like this. You've only to put up a house in that field by the sea and you'll be full up every season. If you don't take the chance, somebody else will, and I'd sooner you had it than anybody, said Mr. Spence, as if he had always had the welfare of the Pinks at heart. The Pinks had lived contentedly for years in their cottage on the village street. Mr. Pink had an allotment, sold his vegetables and put in 2 or 3 days a week in other people's gardens as required. Mrs. Pink had been left a little money by some aunts. She added to this by putting a card in the parlour window inscribed first of all, teas and hot water, extending later to bed and breakfast, and later still to apartments. Further than this, she had no wish to go, she told Mr. Spence. She didn't feel qualified to go, she told him, not having had the experience. Besides, she said, she didn't want to risk her bit of money, which just made all the difference between being anxious about their old age and not having to be anxious. But she showed all the time that she was fascinated by Mr. Spence's proposal, and that proved fatal. It wasn't done in one visit. Mr. Spence worked hard at the Pinks, and how they came to consent They never exactly knew, but consent they must have done, because the plans were got out and the house begun. Arthur Pink then became a fatalist. He accepted the fact that, once begun, it had to be finished. But Mrs. Pink was different. She kept trying to stem the flood of expenditure, to clutch back a bit here, a bit there. "Oh, he's rushing us," she said, keeping her husband awake at night with her fears. "It's much too big," she would say, going to hang over the bricklayers. "Stop it, it's much too big." And the bricklayers would down tools and hang about until Mr. Spence came and told them to get on with the job. Mrs. Pink, at this stage, was beset with suspicion of Mr. Spence. She was sure he was trying to ruin them. "He's rushed us into letting him put that house up, and as long as he gets the money out of us, that's all he's after," she kept saying. But she had to admit later that the money did not seem to be entirely all that Mr. Spence was after. Having taken the Pinks up, he showed every desire to make a success of them. He helped them in every way. Not only did he show Mrs. Pink how to get hold of her money, how to deal with the building society, how to buy furniture on the hire purchase system, but he also told them what papers to advertise in, how to word their advertisements, and how to range their prices. He even gave the house its name. It was called Rosedene. There were no roses, but these would come, he said, and in earnest of them put up a couple of rustic arches. When Rosedene was finished and they at last took possession, the Pinks could hardly believe it. There it was, this large, fine house with all those bedrooms, all theirs. They went over it in awe and pride, Mrs. Pink laying her thin red hand with deep pleasure on the doors, on the furniture, and saying, "Oh, Arthur," at almost every breath. Arthur came behind, as moved as she was, but saying less. Long, thin, with his kind, quiet face, his back a little bowed from much stooping over vegetables, Arthur followed his wife over their new house. Mrs. Pink had provided for others as she'd always provided for herself and Arthur. In consequence, the beds were thin, the blankets thin, the mats on the floor thin, and the curtains at the windows mere strips that would never draw together. The wash on the walls was thin, pale mauve, pink, blue, different in every room, but the paint was the same all over, a sort of bluish white. The linoleum on the landing was so highly varnished that your feet came up from it with a tearing sound, and Mrs. Pink said that would go off in time. Mr. Spence, still helpful, suggested that Mrs. Pink should go over and get some tips about running a boarding house from Mrs. Cooper, who was doing very well with hers at East Bay. Mrs. Pink went, and Mrs. Cooper told her so much she had to buy a penny notebook and write down at once as much as she could remember on the way home on the bus. How many pints of custard made with powder to the dozen persons, how not to bother with fruit pies, but to serve stewed fruit with little squares of pastry made separate, what coffee essence to use, and how to make a substitute for cream, and to put Arthur into a white jacket and send him into the rooms to empty the ashtrays and give tone to the place. "Ah, I can't do that," cried Arthur, horrified. "Arthur," said Mrs. Pink, solemnly, "you'll have to. Now we're in it, we've got to make a go of this place, or we'll lose it altogether. Remember that now, and make up your mind to that white jacket. I shouldn't be surprised either that you'll look very smart in it," she said soothingly. But Mr. Pink was not soothed. He hadn't bargained for going in among strangers, dressed up in a white jacket, emptying ashtrays, he said. He'd never emptied an ashtray in his life, he said. He didn't think he could manage it. But in the end, he admitted, heavily, that if the success of the boarding house depended on the wearing of a white jacket, he supposed he'd have to wear it. And now he was wearing it. Every afternoon towards 5, he came in from the vegetables, wiped his boots, put on his jacket, and went with his long loping step about the rooms, carrying a little tray for cigarette ash and ends, and being very careful not to look at anybody. Incredible though it seemed to the Pinks, the boarding house was an established fact. It stood in the field by the sea, very white and new, with coloured bathing suits hanging out of the windows and Mrs. Walton sitting in a striped chair by the front door. 14 people were staying in the house, sleeping in the bed, sitting down to meals. Help was hard to get in the village, but Mrs. Pink had secured Mrs. Boxer to wash up and Maud Marsden to do the beds and wait at table. Mrs. Pink did the cooking herself. "I think it's best to do my own cooking," she confided, "just till we get our reputation." "That's right," agreed Mrs. Walton from the front door. "If you want a thing done properly, do it yourself, I always say." So Mrs. Pink served her rissoles, her stewed fruit with little squares of pastry cooked separate, her coffee essence and cream substitute, her packet blancmanges and tin soups, and since that was what other boarding houses in other summers had served to them, the visitors made no complaints. It was what they were used to. Mrs. Pink liked her visitors. She liked having Mrs. Walton at the front door. She loved the two pretty young girls, Kathleen Hill and Phoebe Wood, and always took their bathing suits to rinse in fresh water, wring out and dry by the fire so that they should be nice to put on for the next bathe. She liked Mr. Bagshaw, so smart in his pullovers, bow ties and brown and white shoes. It took Arthur about half an hour to clean these shoes, keeping the white off the brown and the brown off the white. But it was worth it, Mrs. Pink said, to keep Mr. Bagshaw smart. It was a pleasure to see him coming in at their gate, she said. She liked to hear from the kitchen Mr. Bagshaw talking in the dining room. "I'll have another portion of jelly, Maud, if you please," he would say. "The bottle of sauce, Maud. Are there any pickles, Maud? The vinegar with this fried place, that's a good girl, Maud." Mr. Bagshaw gave importance to the food. He made the dining room cosy, and Mrs. Pink was glad of him. On chilly mornings, he was as good as a radiator. They were all very friendly in the dining room, calling out from table to table and not minding if they had to wait sometimes between meat and sweet. Only Alfred, Miss Porter's fiancé, was quiet, in spite of Miss Porter's constant efforts to draw him into the general conversation and show him off. Mrs. Pink was worried about Alfred. He didn't seem to be enjoying himself, and she wanted people to enjoy themselves at Rosedene, not only because she hoped they would come again, but for their own sakes too. Miss Porter played golf, because she thinks it's smart, remarked Mrs. Walton, calling inwards to Mrs. Pink from the front door. Alfred did not care for golf, but he had to play it. He would rather have bathed, but Miss Porter didn't bathe. "Too skinny," cried Mrs. Walton. The sun shone, the sea beyond the garden wall was blue, the air was strong and pure. Things were going well at Rosedene, and Mr. and Mrs. Pink, when they went to bed at night, congratulated themselves on their ability to manage. "We're managing, Arthur," Mrs. Pink would say, "and you know I thought we never should." Then Mr. Spence, still being helpful, called with the General. The General was a familiar figure in West Bay. Not that he spoke much to people, but they were used to the sight of him. He had been a great man in the army in his time, someone said, but now he was retired and lived in a little house far out on the salt marshes. His passions, shared apparently by his wife, were birds and yachting, lonely passions both, and ones that did not bring him into close contact with the villagers. They went rather in awe of him, Mrs. Pink among them, and she was flustered when she saw him standing in the hall with Mr. Spence. She was still more flustered when she found he had come to see if she could take his sister from London as a boarder for a fortnight. "Well," said Mrs. Pink uncertainly, looking not at the General but at Mr. Spence, "I could show you a room." "Oh, that'll be all right," said the General dismissingly. A wind had sprung up and he wanted to be off to his yacht. "I only wanted to know if you could take her. We can't put her up ourselves. Very cramped quarters, you know, and too far out and all that. She wouldn't like it." "Right you are then, Mrs. Pink. She'll be here Tuesday night. She'll dine with us and I'll bring her in later. Denby Moore, the name is. Got it? Very well. Good morning to you." Mr. Spence conducted the General to his old car and returned to collect his due of thanks from Mrs. Pink. "I'm ever so grateful to you, Mr. Spence," said Mrs. Pink, doing as she was expected, "but I do hope I'll be able to manage." "You've been hoping that from the start," said Mr. Spence jovially, "and you've managed, haven't you? Nice gentleman, the General, isn't he? What a car! If I couldn't drive a better car than that," said Mr. Spence with feeling. "By George, I couldn't drive one at all." And he returned, with complacence, to his own superior automobile. It was so late on Tuesday night, when Mrs. Denby Moore was brought in by the General, that Mrs. Pink had no more than one awed glimpse of her before she went to bed. But early next morning, the trouble began. It was Mrs. Pink's innocent habit to send by Maud to each visitor in bed a cup of what she considered nice, hot, strong tea, with 2 lumps of sugar in the saucer. She didn't charge for this, it was just something she liked to do for her visitors. But Maud returned from Mrs. Denby Moore's room, cup in hand. "She doesn't want your tea," she said, putting it down on the table. "What is it?" she said, looking into the cup, as if she'd never seen anything like it before. "It's tea," I said. "I don't drink tea like that," she said. "I have china and I pour it out myself, and have you no tray, girl?" Of course we've got a tray, I said, but we haven't got 14 trays, which is what we'd need if everybody in this house had to have a tray. But you don't need to drink the tea, I said. There's no obligation. It's only kindness on Mrs. Pink's part, I said, sending it round. I told her straight, said Maud, arranging her curls at the looking-glass over the sink. Mrs. Pink wasn't listening to Maud. A slow blush had suffused her face. Wasn't it the thing to offer tea to the visitors? Was it presumption? Mrs. Pink felt a deep shame at that thought. She mustn't send it round any more. She wants her breakfast in bed, Maud was saying. You should see her. She's got her chin tied up like a corpse and diamond rings thrown about the dressing table. She's got a peach pink nightdress on, all lace at the top. My goodness, I wish it were mine. What good is it to her at her age? Asked Maud, admiring her young reflection in the glass. You'd better run out to the shop, Maud, said Mrs. Pink, coming to herself, and see if they've got any China tea. Bring £half a pound. But when she sent up China tea for Mrs. Denby Moore's breakfast, Mrs. Denby Moore sent it down again. She said she had coffee for breakfast. But then when Mrs. Pink sent up a jug of nice hot coffee essence, Mrs. Moore sent it down, saying not that sort of coffee, and demanding China tea again. If she thinks I'm going to spend my time running up and down with what she wants and doesn't want, said Maud indignantly, she's mistaken, that's all. Mrs. Denby Moore also rejected the kipper Mrs. Pink had carefully cooked for her, and Mrs. Pink began to feel doubtful about her menus for the rest of the day. Would the mince do for lunch? She feared it wouldn't. She rushed out to the butcher's and, against her better judgment, bought 2 legs of lamb, too fresh, she knew, to eat anything but tough. The unprofitable purchase lay heavy on her mind as she made the beds with Maud. She herself tiptoed carefully about, but Maud wouldn't. The linoleum on the landing made its usual tearing protest every time Maud crossed it, which was often. And then the thing that Mrs. Pink had dreaded happened. Mrs. Denby Moore rang her bell. Across Mr. Bagshaw's denuded bed, Mrs. Pink and Maud looked at each other. You'd better go, Maud, said Mrs. Pink. I'm not going, said Maud, setting her mouth. I've answered that bell often enough this morning, and if it means my notice, I'm not answering it again. Mrs. Pink's heart, already beating too fast from the ring of the bell, beat faster still at Maud's impertinence. She ought to rebuke Maud, she knew, but for the moment she couldn't. She would deal with Maud, she hoped, later. Nervously smoothing her apron and putting back a strand of hair, she crossed the landing. What is that extraordinary noise? Asked Mrs. Denby Moore, sitting up in bed in a cape of pink feathers. That incessant tearing sound. It's the linoleum, faltered Mrs. Pink. It's new. You see, this is our first season. But her voice tailed away. It was no use, she could see, saying anything like that to Mrs. Denby Moore. I can't stand noise of any kind, said Mrs. Moore. Certainly not an absurd noise like that. Do something about it, please. And somebody must do something about these curtains, she said, turning her beautiful, tired, bored eyes to the window. They don't meet. What was the good of putting up such curtains, Mrs. Pink? They're neither useful nor ornamental. I don't like light in the mornings, and I like an eiderdown on my bed. She dropped her eyes to her book to show that the conversation was finished. Mrs. Pink stood there humbly for a moment, and then went out. An eiderdown? There wasn't one in the house. She would have to go to East Bay and buy one. But what an expense! Mrs. Pink went back to finish the beds with Maud. It was well known in the village that Maud was difficult. Maud could afford to be difficult. The demand for her services exceeded by far the supply, and Mrs. Pink had thought herself very lucky to get her. She'd always got on well with Maud, but now she felt the trouble was beginning. She and Maud finished the beds in awkward silence. And soon another awkward situation developed. Mrs. Walton started calling out from the front door. More noise, thought Mrs. Pink in a panic, and ran to answer Mrs. Walton at close quarters in a low voice. But Mrs. Walton kept calling out, and Mrs. Pink had to keep running out to answer her, and the morning was flying away with no work done. At last she had to tell Mrs. Walton that she hadn't time to keep leaving her work to run out to the front, and she daren't shout in answer from wherever she happened to be, because Mrs. Denby Moore had already complained about the noise. But she saw at once that she had mortally offended Mrs. Walton. "So, I suppose this Mrs. Denby Moore, as you call her," said Mrs. Walton witheringly and with injustice, since Mrs. Pink had no choice but to call Mrs. Denby Moore by her name. "I suppose she's the only person to be considered," finished Mrs. Walton. Nobody likes being asked not to shout, and Mrs. Walton liked it no better than another. Mrs. Pink returned, wretched, to the kitchen. Everything was going wrong. And it continued to go wrong. She cooked the legs of lamb, as she considered, to a turn, but Mrs. Denby Moore did not come down to the dining room until everyone, except the two young girls, had left it. The girls had come in late from the beach, and apologising to Maud, who surprised them by tossing her head, they sat down to gobble their lunch and get out of Maud's way as quickly as possible. But before they could finish, Mrs. Denby Moore came in, with Mrs. Pink hovering behind her. "I'll sit here," said Mrs. Moore, going to the window. "Well," said Mrs. Pink nervously, "that's Mr. Bagshaw's table, but I dare say, being a gentleman, he'll let you have it." Mrs. Denby Moore sat down, and Mrs. Pink withdrew to send in her lunch. The girls were gaping. They'd never seen anyone like Mrs. Moore before, never seen such beautiful grey hair, never seen such a linen coat and skirt before, such a pearl necklace, such hands, such an expression of sad ennui anywhere. Compassion and admiration showed in their eyes. For one who had been so beautiful to be so old, their eyes said. "I'm late," said Mrs. Moore from Mr. Bagshaw's table. The girls were startled. They had not expected her to speak to them. They smiled diffidently and put their curls back. "It takes me a long time to dress myself," said Mrs. Moore bitterly. "I'm not used to it." Phoebe stared. Not used to dressing herself? Maud now laid a plate of roast lamb before Mrs. Moore. "What is it?" asked the lady. "It's best leg of lamb," said Maud pertly. "I don't want it," said Mrs. Moore. "Tell Mrs. Pink I'd like salad and brown bread and butter and cheese." She sighed, waiting, and rubbed her wrist. "My arms ache so when I put my own hair up," she said to the girls. "I hate it." Phoebe continued to stare. Did she go to a hairdresser then, every single morning? But Kathleen, swiftly adapting herself to a mode of life she had only read of, suggested diffidently, "Perhaps you miss your maid." Phoebe turned her stare from Mrs. Moore to her friend. How did Kathleen know about ladies' maids? How did she know Mrs. Moore had one? Kathleen seemed suddenly experienced, worldly, and swept far away from Phoebe. "I certainly miss my maid," said Mrs. Moore. "She had to have her holiday, I suppose, but it meant my taking a holiday too. I couldn't possibly manage in London without her, though God knows I go out little enough these days." She sighed heavily and looked unseeingly out of the window, crushed with the boredom of being where she was, of being a widow, of not being invited anywhere for this fortnight. "It's cutlet for cutlet," she thought bitterly. "I can't entertain, so no one entertains me now. To think that I should have come to a place like this, after the life," she thought, "I've lived." She closed her eyes against the dining room. But opened them again on being addressed by Maud. "Do you want the mayonnaise?" said Maud truculently, bringing it. "Out of a bottle?" said Mrs. Moore. "No." Maud went out of the dining room, but spoke in a loud voice in the passage outside. "It's 2:15 and my afternoon off," she said. "I'm not going to stand this, so you know, Mrs. Pink. I've no need to." "What an ill-mannered girl," said Mrs. Moore, eating her salad. "Oh, I'm surprised Mrs. Pink keeps her." "She's not always like that," ventured Phoebe defendingly, and blushed. Mrs. Moore seemed not to hear. She was looking out of the window again as if she were alone. The girls laid down their spoons with as little noise as possible. They'd finished, and Phoebe thought they could now go. But Kathleen, with a frown, signalled that they must remain in their places. Phoebe stared again. Until now, Kathleen had been as eager as she had to get back to the beach. What was the fun of spending this splendid afternoon sitting on at the table when they'd finished? Asked Phoebe's blue eyes. But Kathleen ignored the question. Outside the dining room door, Mrs. Pink waited with a serving of bluish blancmange in her hand ready to bring on, since Maud wouldn't. After a while, she went to stand uncertainly in the kitchen. If she couldn't get the tables cleared soon, she'd never get through her work today, she grieved. She went to look through the crack of the door again, but Mrs. Moore was, as Mrs. Pink put it, still at it, her salad unfinished on her plate. At last, Plucking up her courage, Mrs. Pink advanced with the blancmange. "No, thank you," said Mrs. Moore, rising. "Will someone put a chair for me in the garden?" But when Mrs. Pink had placed the chair, Mrs. Moore, after one look about her, followed Mrs. Pink back into the house. "Does that enormous woman sit there all the time?" she asked in her cool, carrying voice. "Well, generally," admitted Mrs. Pink. "Then I shall sit indoors," said Mrs. Moore. "Where is there?" Mrs. Pink led the way to the drawing room, to the best three-piece suite, the pampas grass in the Japanese vases, the looking-glass screen painted with bulrushes in the hearth. Mrs. Moore closed her eyes on entering, but turned to smile charmingly over her shoulder to the girls who hovered in the hall, Phoebe because Kathleen detained her by the hand. "Are you coming in here?" she said. "It is at least cool." Kathleen drew Phoebe after her, and they sat side by side on the sofa, their young backs rounded, their curls falling forward, Phoebe's toes turned in. Mrs. Moore sat in a hard, high chair, like a queen. Mrs. Pink went back to the kitchen. She was filled with nervous trepidation lest Mrs. Walton should have overheard herself being called an enormous woman. But Mrs. Walton's manner had been so cold since that morning that Mrs. Pink, though she went specially round by the front door, couldn't tell whether there had been an increase of offence or not. She worried about it all afternoon and forgot the baking powder in the scones for tea. In the drawing room, Mrs. Moore was talking to the girls. Phoebe felt resentfully that she only talked to them because she had nothing else to do. She kept them with her to beguile the time that hung so heavy on her hands, but time for Phoebe went so fast during the holidays. It was so precious, and yet here they had to sit with this bored person while the tide was going out, leaving long stretches of cool sand over which Phoebe loved to pad in her bare feet. Oh, it was too bad, thought Phoebe, shuffling on the sofa, but Kathleen, with a pinch, quelled her. The wistful expression of Phoebe's face increased. She was too young to dare to be rude enough to get up and go. "How pretty you are, my dear child," said Mrs. Moore graciously to Kathleen. "Now that I come to look at you, I find you remind me of Princess Amelie when she was a young girl." Kathleen had never heard of Princess Amelie, but she blushed with pleasure. This was a compliment she would never forget. "I once had my room directly under Princess Amelie's," said Mrs. Moore, brightening in reminiscence. "She used to do gymnastic exercises at 6 o'clock in the morning over my head. I had to send up in the end to tell her she mustn't start until after 7:30. Kathleen almost gasped. Fancy telling princesses what they mustn't do. "Of course, they were very keen on keeping their figures," said Mrs. Moore. "Princess Elizabeth, you know, used to sleep wrapped from head to foot in cold water bandages. No pillow. No one knew that better than she did." To Kathleen, this was the most entrancing conversation she had ever heard in her life. She drank it in. But Phoebe looked through the window at the sky. Oh, to be out, to be able to go. A whole afternoon wasted, and they had so few. "The Grand Duke once asked to be presented," Mrs. Moore was saying, when Phoebe brought her attention into the room again. "I was the only one," said Mrs. Moore, smiling reminiscently. Although Mrs. Moore had come to West Bay because her brother lived here, she would not, it appeared, be going much to his house. "His wife's such a tiresome woman," said Mrs. Moore. Phoebe was dumbfounded. Fancy saying a thing like that! Why, Phoebe didn't like her brother's wife either, not really, nobody in the family did, but no one would dream of saying so, even to each other, let alone to people never seen before. And in a moment, Mrs. Moore shocked Phoebe again. "I'm so poor now," said Mrs. Moore in disgust. Fancy talking about being poor, thought Phoebe in astonishment, a thing surely everybody tried to hide. Besides, how could she be poor when she had a maid and a pearl necklace and diamond rings? Phoebe stared in bewilderment, but Kathleen was sympathetic. Smarmy, Phoebe thought suddenly. It was tea time before Phoebe got away, and even then Kathleen remained behind with Mrs. Moore. Dinner that night was an uncomfortable affair. Maud's report of Mr. Bagshaw's displeasure at being deprived of his table threw Mrs. Pink into such distress that she burnt the gravy at the last moment. "Oh, Arthur," she said to Mr. Pink, standing by in helpless concern, "I feel at my wit's end." In the dining room, in the elegant presence of Mrs. Moore, sitting with an absent expression at Mr. Bagshaw's table, there was silence instead of the usual cheerful hubbub. The dispossessed Mr. Bagshaw sulked on the side. He didn't even ask for the sauce. Mrs. Walton sat in heavy displeasure. Miss Porter did not hold Alfred's hand, instead holding it down on the table. She confined herself to sending him fond glances through the sweet peas. Mrs. Burton corrected her little boys frequently, but in whispers, motioning with her head towards Mrs. Moore as if she was using that lady as a bogeyman to frighten them into good behaviour. Mrs. Moore herself broke the silence. "What is it?" she asked as Maud proffered a dish. "It's custard," said Maud in a highly dangerous tone. "Custard?" said Mrs. Moore. The aqueous yellow blobs trembled beneath her gaze. "No, thank you," she said. Maud controlled herself until she reached the kitchen, but she burst out there. "If she asks me again what anything is, I'm leaving, just so you know," she shouted, "making a fool of me in front of everybody." And the next day, she left. She marched into the kitchen after lunch and took her apron off. "You can keep this week's money," she said. "I can make it up somewhere else." Mrs. Pink sat down and cried. "I can't imagine," Mrs. Moore was saying with a shudder in the dining room, "how I'm going to survive a fortnight in this dreadful place. But I can't get away from it. I shall have to stay until my maid comes to fetch me. She'll pack for me. It's so dreadful for me getting about nowadays," she sighed. "My husband was such a perfect courier." "Does that mean he was in a travel agency?" asked Phoebe afterwards. "Oh, Phoebe, don't be so stupid," cried Kathleen. "Her husband was an ambassador." Kathleen was horrified by Phoebe's ignorance. She hadn't realised until now how little Phoebe knew. In Mrs. Moore's presence, Kathleen was painfully conscious of Phoebe's shortcomings. She was ashamed of her. She was ashamed of everybody in the house. That night, the visitors were astonished to see Mr. Pink, in his white jacket, come in to wait on them at dinner. He had to. There was no one else. Their eyes followed him about. Phoebe saw how his hands trembled as he proffered the potatoes. "It makes me kind of uncomfortable to see him doing this," she said uneasily to Kathleen. But in a cool voice, copied from Mrs. Moore, Kathleen said that was because he did it so badly, and the rift between the friends widened. Across the room, Phoebe met Alfred's eyes and saw that he felt as she did about Mr. Pink. Miss Porter caught them looking at each other and put her hand over Alfred's on the table to show that he was hers. The visitors had been submerged, as it were, under the constraint of Mrs. Moore's presence. Now they were coming up again, but changed. Mr. Bagshaw was asking for things again, but differently. "The sauce, Pink. This meat needs pickles, Pink. Where are they? I like vinegar with my fried place, as I've said before." The eyes of the Pinks, as they tried to cope with their boarders, were wild, like the eyes of cattle crossing a deep river. Disaffection, started by Mrs. Moore, set in, and there were many complaints. And then to make things worse for the Pinks, the weather changed. The wind blew in all day from the sea and dimmed the windows with a fine cold mist, and everybody stayed in the house. "We tried to play golf," said Miss Porter, coming in with Alfred behind her, "but it was so muddy." Alfred looked at Phoebe, and his look was desperate. Mrs. Walton could no longer sit at the front door, and she would not sit in the same room as Mrs. Moore. For a day or two, she sat in the hallway, but at the end of the week she announced that she would finish her holiday at Mrs. Cooper's at East Bay, where there was a sun porch and nobody who considered themselves too good for other people. When Mr. Bagshaw heard this, and that he would be given proper consideration, he said he would go too. Mrs. Burton could not keep her little boys confined to the house quiet enough for Mrs. Moore, and her temper and theirs suffered in consequence. And then Mr. Pink fell with the potatoes at dinner. His white jacket caught on the back of a chair, and he fell headlong, the potatoes rolling in all directions. The visitors sprang to their feet, but it was Phoebe and Alfred who reached them. They helped Mr. Pink up with murmurs of compassion. They retrieved the potatoes from under their chairs and put them back into the dish for him. With bowed back and shamefaced eyes, Mr. Pink went out of the dining room. Nobody spoke, but Phoebe and Alfred in the middle of the room looked at each other. There were tears in Phoebe's eyes. Mr. Pink did not reappear. After a long pause, Mrs. Pink brought in more potatoes. You must help yourselves, she said, putting the dishes on the sideboard. After dinner, when Alfred went out into the garden, Miss Porter went after him, and they had a dreadful quarrel. Miss Porter broke off the engagement. In the kitchen, Mrs. Pink was weeping among the after-dinner chaos. "I can't go on, Arthur," she wept. "I can't." "No," said Arthur, standing beside her in distress. They were too timid and too proud for such a life. They could not expose themselves any more. "It would have been all right if the General's sister hadn't come," wept Mrs. Pink. "I was getting on all right until she came. Places like this aren't for people like that, Arthur. They should keep out." "Aye," said Arthur heavily, "they should." They talked late into the night and came to their decision. In the morning, after breakfast, Mrs. Pink asked everybody to go. Miss Porter had already gone by the early train. Mrs. Walton and Mr. Bagshaw were going, so there were not many left to dismiss. "We're closing down," said Mrs. Pink, "so you must please make your arrangements. There's plenty of room at East Bay. We've made out your bills up to today, charging half price this week for inconvenience caused. We're very sorry," finished Mrs. Pink, "but it can't be helped." The sensation died down. It died quickly because war was declared soon afterwards. The declaration of war was, so to speak, useful to the Pinks. "The war came, you know," Mrs. Pink used to explain later when they were back, minus Mrs. Pink's money, in their cottage, "so we had to give up Rosedene." She should have said, "Mrs. Moore came," but perhaps nobody would have recognised that as a reason. I mean, it's so much from another time, isn't it, in terms of the snobbery and the class distinctions and, you know, but also so resonance today in the kind of eternal embarrassment and shame and awkwardness and uncomfortableness and everyone hurting each other's feelings, maybe meaning to, maybe not, or I don't know. But Dorothy Whipple is so sort of incisive and to the point and so funny in her really low-key way. That story, Boarding House, is from the Persephone collection that's called Every Good Deed and Other Stories by Dorothy Whipple. And I hope you enjoyed it. Lovely to have you all again this rather grey Wednesday. Maybe it'll brighten up later. And yeah, lovely having you. And we'll do more on Friday, okay? See you then.